Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now when it launched back in 2019, the GTX 1650 was considered pretty poor value compared to its competition. Take for example AMD's RX 570, a card that was 2 years older, 10% faster and cheaper on the used market. The performance uplift over the 3-year-old 1050 Ti wasn't exactly overwhelming either. The version I have here is one of the better examples of the 1650. It's a later released GDDR6 model which performs better than the GDDR5 original, plus it has no 6-pin connector, making it an ideal plug and play card for OEM systems and low wattage PSUs. While it still makes far more sense to opt for the superior super version of the 1650 over both the original GDDR5 and GDDR6 non-super cards, especially if there's a minimal price difference, one of these still has its uses in 2026, that's for sure. But can it game? And how well does it handle newer and more demanding titles? I've paired it with my modern, yet fairly modest and still pretty capable i5-12400F, and today we're going to jump into a selection of 15 games to find out. Let's start with some of the classics games that we know will run pretty well on the 1650 GDDR6 here. We'll start with Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p with the medium preset. MSAA as well as FSR was turned off here for an average of 185 FPS across 3 games. The 1% low was recorded as 121 and the 0.1% low was 62. I noticed a few little drops to the frame rate when I got wiped out in water on certain maps. Weirdly, the frame rate completely dropped, but apart from that, the performance was excellent. With Fortnite at 1080p with a medium preset here and TAA with 100% res scale, we saw 109 FPS, a 1% low of 90 and a 0.1% low of 83. These percentile low numbers represent a very consistent gameplay experience, and I was using DX12 mode here, which does run better on this card. Let's move on to newer and slightly more intensive games now, and during these tests you may notice that we have had to use a little bit of help from FSR upscaling. With our first newer game, Ark Raiders, that wasn't actually necessary here. We're using the low preset with TSR for an average of 60 frames per second. Now of course enabling upscaling will help boost us over that 60 FPS threshold, but I like to always test games on settings I'd probably use, and so that's no different here. So 60 frames per second with a 1% low of 46 and a 0.1% low of 15. A little bit of FSR here wouldn't go amiss, to be honest, and that's going to really help out in those more demanding areas. In Battlefield 6 we couldn't really hit at least 60 frames per second without FSR, and I had to use the balanced option here, which I think still looks pretty good. We are of course using the low preset, and overall we saw 64 frames per second. This is the Eastwood map, and I'm going to try and stick to this one for all my gameplay benchmarks just to give things a little more consistency across the board here. Now what I was particularly surprised by was the percentile lows, 44 and 40. Really not much stutter going on here, and overall performance was pretty solid considering the card we're using in our system, in my opinion. Borderlands 4 up next, and yeah, this is where things drop a little bit, but I was expecting this from Borderlands 4. We're using the lowest settings, and it didn't really matter what we did with FSR. I set it to quality, and then I set it to balanced, and then I set it to performance, but we were still averaging less than 40 frames per second, and nothing else really improved. There were no advantages. 2 different FSR presets with the 1650. I think it's because this is a 4 gig card, of course, and we were just VRAM limited from the get-go here, so nothing we really did in terms of upscaling improved the gameplay performance. Sure, it's playable. It would probably feel a little bit better with a 30 FPS cap so that we're not seeing significant differences between performance numbers in different areas, because hitting 30 is certainly something that the 1650 can do here. It's just that a cap would make things more consistent, but it's entirely up to you, of course, and that is the beauty of PC gaming. It's all down to personal preference. Next up we have the newly released Crimson Desert. Now I wasn't sure what to expect here. We've played this one with the 1066 gig and 3 gig. There we got about 30 frames per second, but I think the 1650 did a little better here without as much of a visual sacrifice. It could be because this game received an update recently, but we are of course using the low preset as well as FSR 3.1 balance. Now in games that actually state the FSR version, I've also stated it on screen, but in previous games, Borderlands 4, Battlefield 6, it didn't actually say what FSR version they're using, so I've just copied the settings as they are stated in the settings menu. But Crimson Desert specifically states FSR 3.1 here, 39 frames per second overall, and I don't think that's too bad. There will be some flickering issues here and there, which I've noticed on a few different hardware configurations, but overall, yeah, it was a far better experience than I was initially anticipating, and even our 0.1% and 1% lows held up pretty well too. We're seeing 30 FPS as that 1% low frame rate, and 26 FPS, almost said 25, but 25.5 will round up to 26 FPS with that 0.1% low frame rate figure. So not bad at all, considering the hardware and considering the game. For GTA 5 Enhanced here, I thought we'd use the enhanced version of the game, as it is of course newer and looks better and is therefore more demanding on a variation of different hardware. We were able to run this with the high preset and TAA. TAA does look a little blurry even with the sharpness slider turned right up, but I found that FSR can still allow us to hit 60 frames per second, but there will be a few dips and drops below this. I'm absolutely fine with that, so it is up to you as to whether or not you want to enable FSR over TAA, as FSR native does look a lot better than TAA, and to be honest, the FSR quality preset probably looks better than TAA. You could probably drop it a bit lower than that too, but here 87 frames per second with a 1% low of 75 and a 0.1% low of 70. If you're looking for a cheap card to play GTA 5 Enhanced, well, the 1650 is going to do an excellent job. For Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, we have 1080p of course, and you guessed it, the low preset here with FSR 3.1 quality. Now I probably didn't need to be as sort of intense with the FSR preset here. In this one, I'm sort of happy with 40 FPS. That goes for most sort of first person titles as well, but I just had it in my head that I wanted to try and target 60, and I was curious as to the sort of sacrifice we'd need to make. It turns out it's not a huge sacrifice. FSR 3.1 quality doesn't look that bad, but you will notice a lot of popping. I think that's because of the VRAM limitation, so you might see grass popping in last minute, some flickering on tree textures, stuff like that, and performance is certainly going to vary depending on where you are, but here 66 FPS overall, a 1% low of 49 and a 0.1% low of 41, so it was fairly smooth overall. Resident Evil Requiem up next with the lowest settings of course, and TAA. Now I actually stuck with TAA here instead of enabling upscaling, as I was pretty satisfied with the 46 FPS average, and this is in fact a more intensive area of the game. If you're inside running through narrow corridor areas, then you're going to see closer to and above 60 FPS there, so I'm willing to sort of make that compromise, you know, get closer to 60 FPS in those indoor areas and then put up with the 45 FPS in those busy outdoor areas. It feels absolutely fine to me, but again, it's all up to you, personal preference and all that. 46 FPS here, a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 37, pretty consistent overall. The less said about Oblivion Remastered, the better. We're using the lowest settings, FSR performance, not that it made a difference, and I even dropped the in-game render resolution to like 50% while turning FSR off, and nothing I could really do would allow us to exceed 20 FPS. FSR Ultra Performance as well, I think, was an option that I selected. No change at all, 21 FPS, a 1% low of 11 and a 0.1% low of 9. Pretty shocking, but not too unexpected, given that this is similar to what I've seen in other benchmark videos. This card really struggles here. For Clair Obscur Expedition 33 with 1080p in the lowest settings, we're using FSR balanced for 35 FPS. Now we can actually get away with FSR quality in those less intensive areas, but as soon as I moved into those more crowded scenes and started walking through like hordes of NPCs, yeah, this is where things dropped a little more towards 30 frames per second. 35 overall I don't think was too bad. The percentile lows leave a little to be desired, 25 and 6. Yeah, there's a real problem with that 0.1% figure. This is VRAM related, I think, causing the occasional stutter here. Something that won't be too uncommon across the most demanding of games, but it's something we've not encountered to this extreme thus far, apart from Oblivion, I'd say, and perhaps a little bit in Borderlands 4 too. Where Winds Meet is up next, 1080p with, you guessed it, the lowest settings and FSR set to 70% scaling for 65 FPS. I didn't intend to target 60 here, I just chose these options based on pure guesswork from the settings menu, and yeah, this happened to give us at least 60 FPS. It will vary depending on where you are, of course, but this little gameplay session here, consisting of about 25 minutes of gameplay, saw us average 65 overall, and the percentile lows were pretty good too, 48 and 40. The Outer Worlds 2 next. I think this is another UE5 title, is it not? So I'm not too surprised to see the lower performance here, but we still managed 30 FPS with FSR performance mode selected. We need FSR performance to give us that boost to 30 FPS, otherwise we were looking at the sort of mid-20s with any other FSR preset. We are going to need the lowest settings, of course, though, and overall this isn't really all that playable, but I was surprised to see this number. I was expecting sort of that 0.1% figure of 19 to be the average. So yeah, better than expected is all I can say. We'll cycle back to a few sort of older, yet still pretty demanding games once you crank the settings up. We'll talk about Cyberpunk 2077 here, 1080p with the low preset, so not the lowest settings, just the low preset, which does include a few medium options, I believe, and FSR 3 balanced here. Again, I wasn't targeting 60 FPS necessarily. These settings were just based on guesswork. I thought this will probably give us a decent result. I thought maybe at least 40 FPS, but 64 overall. The 1% low of 50 was fine, and the 0.1% low of 16, well, that does indicate a few dips and drops. Again, likely because of the VRAM limitation with this older card. Red Dead Redemption 2 to finalise, then ultra textures here because I think this is the only option that makes sense. Everything else looks significantly worse. Everything else was set to lowest apart from the geometry LOD was maxed out and the grass LOD, which was set to 2 out of 10, and we of course had TAA set to medium. Again for plus 60 FPS, 65 here, which I wasn't expecting. This will drop a bit in and around busier towns, but consistency wise it held up fairly well too, 49 and 43 with those percentile lows. Overall then, you may want to look out for a 1650 Super if you're looking for a 1650 based card, but I think as a card that is going to be able to be put into a lower power system, one with a weaker or older PSU, one that perhaps doesn't have a 6-pin connector, then a 1650 like this, the GDDR6 model preferably, is still going to be absolutely fine in some cases. You want to play CS2, Fortnite, GTA, things like that. For less than £100 or dollars, it's not a bad option at all. Always consider other options at a similar price point based on where you live, of course, but I don't think this card did too badly at all today, especially when it came to those more demanding releases. But let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you as always for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed this one, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.